Good morning, good morning. Today's Native American Heritage Convocation is sponsored by the Office of Intercultural Life here at Carleton College. Our speaker is Sean Sherman, a chef who's been cooking across the U.S. and Mexico for over the past 30 years and who has become renowned nationally and internationally in the culinary movement of indigenous foods. His main focus has been on the revitalization and evolution of indigenous food systems throughout North America. He studied extensively to determine the foundations of these food systems to gain a full understanding of bringing back a sense of Native American cuisine to today's world. In 2014, he opened the business The Sioux Chef as a caterer and food educator in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. He also designed and opened the Tatanka Truck, which featured 100% pre-contact foods of the Dakota and Minnesota territories. The Sioux Chef team continues with their mission to help educate and make indigenous foods more accessible to as many communities as possible through the recently founded nonprofit North American Traditional Indigenous Food Systems. The title of his presentation is The Revolution of Indigenous Food Systems of North America. Please welcome Sean Sherman.
All right. Ihani Washte, Wambly Watakbe Nichiape. My name is Sean Sherman. I am from Pine Ridge Reservation. I am Oglala Lakota. My parents were both born on Pine Ridge Reservation. I moved to Minneapolis in the late 90s. I think it was like around 97 after college. And I started working in restaurants at actually a really young age. I was only 13 when I got my first restaurant job. In South Dakota, they don't really care how old you are as long as you can wash some dishes or bust some tables. So that's just the way it was. And I worked in restaurants basically my whole life because I'm old now. And it just worked lots of different restaurants. So in the Black Hills, it was a lot of touristy restaurants. I remember the first restaurant was a mining-themed restaurant called The Sluice. I remember we had a mining cart salad bar. After college, I moved to Minneapolis, and I landed in Uptown area, and just spent a lot of time working in various restaurants. But I got a really good, really good experience. I worked at some really fun spaces, and I learned a lot, and I grew a lot. And I didn't go to culinary school. I became a chef by complete accident. It was never intended, and I really wouldn't wish it on many people either, because it's a lot of work. But I started working in restaurants in Minneapolis and moved my way up really quickly, and I became a chef in Uptown at a pretty young age. I was about 27 when I got my first chef career job and was really able to grow. So I had a pretty good chef career in Minneapolis. I worked really hard. I had a lot of write-ups in the paper back then, and it kind of set my career as a chef, and I just kind of fell into it, right? But a few years into that chef career, I kind of had the epiphany of the work that I'm doing right now, because I realized myself personally, actually, it goes like this. I moved down to Mexico because after a really particularly tough chef job where I was overseeing way too many restaurants and I was working way too many hours and I was a little burnt, I just took a backpack and a guitar and moved down to a beach in Mexico, this little tiny town called San Pancho, just north of Puerto Vallarta. And I was sitting on the beach, I was reading a ton of books, just trying to figure out my next move, and there was a group of indigenous peoples down there called the Huichole. And the Huichol, I thought, were really interesting because they had really beautiful artwork and this really beautiful beadwork, and their stories were really rich. And it reminded me of a lot of the Lakota artwork that I saw and a lot of the Lakota mythology and religion that I grew up with. So it was really striking to me. And I became really curious and started reading about them. And all of a sudden I had this epiphany of doing what I'm doing because I realized that they were just like my long-lost indigenous cousins from like way south, right? I saw so much commonality within them as I did growing up on Pine Ridge Reservation within my own family. And so not only did we have correlations of how we talked about religion and spirits and animals and plants and just like kind of this energy and everything, but also to even simple things like their mannerisms, you know, like their sense of humor. There's something funny. There's something just like in indigenous peoples, like we just have this kind of this similar sense of humor. It's really dry, but it's really I don't know, it's comforting. So, anyways, I all of a sudden realized that I didn't really know anything about my own indigenous food heritage as a chef. Like I could name hundreds of recipes from European nations all over. Like I could name a whole bunch of Italian recipes in Italian. I knew a bunch of German recipes. I knew a bunch of Spanish recipes in those languages. And I could only name like a handful of like Lakota recipes, you know? And that was really kind of striking to me because obviously I grew up on the reservation, my parents grew up on the reservation, my grandparents were the first generation of people to go through the boarding schools on the reservation. And it just became that question, it's like, where did all of that knowledge go about indigenous foods? You know, so I remember asking my mom, telling her these thoughts that I was having about Lakota food and just trying to find out where do I even begin, how do I search for it, because I couldn't go online and buy a Joy of Native American Cooking because it didn't exist, right? So my mom's like, oh no, I've got a Lakota cookbook for you, you can have it, so just come over to the house. So I went over to her house and she gives me this little paper cookbook, you know, it looks like a Lutheran church cookbook, kind of, right? And it's like Pine Ridge Cooking or something like that. And it was just a bunch of recipes. It's like, this isn't what I'm looking for, you know, because she's like, why? These are like our Lakota foods. Like, I'm looking for things that don't have cream of mushroom soup in it, you know? Because I know we have more realistic foods of what our ancestors were eating, and I know that our ancestors are not opening up a can of Campbell's soup and dumping it into some, you know, pot of whatever. So I kept searching, you know? So it really led me down a path to try and understand, because I had this vision of what indigenous peoples were utilizing, and part of it came for my own education. Right out of high school, I worked for the U.S. Forest Service in the Northern Black Hills as a field surveyor, so I had to learn all the plants in the Northern Black Hills as part of my job, and that knowledge really stuck with me because I realized there was so much plants out there and there's so many cool uses for things, there's so many flavors and there's so many different kinds of berries that I wouldn't have known about if I hadn't fallen into that path early on. So I knew my indigenous ancestors that they had to live completely symbiotically with the world around them, that they had generations upon generations of understanding the world around them, utilizing plants and animals primarily to be completely sustainable, you know, and completely organic when it comes down to it. So I had so many questions, like what were my ancestors eating? Were they growing anything? Were they trading with people? How were they preserving foods? You know, how were they getting through these long, long winters and all those things? And it forced me also to read a lot of history, and I think that's the best place to start. Because why aren't there more Native American restaurants out there, you know? We just opened one in Minneapolis called Awamni, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But we're really the first and the only kind of restaurant like this out there in the entire nation, unfortunately, right now. Because it shouldn't be a hard thing to like go anywhere in this nation and be like, where can I get some indigenous foods that really represent the land and the space and the history and the culture of that land space right there, right? And it's just not there. And the reason is just because of the history of things. It's like it's the reason why. It's how indigenous peoples were treated. So it's really important, I think, to start with a better remote. There we go. So it's really important to understand that no matter where we are in indigenous, in the United States or in North America, that we're standing on indigenous land spaces. And there's indigenous cultures and there's indigenous histories. And it's really important to understand that concept because there's so much diversity out there. You know, there's so much to understand of how things were before Europeans showed up. And there's still an immense amount of indigenous peoples out there today. So I think it's really important to understand when we're talking about things like what we did, the kinds of foods that we did. Like we just cut out colonial ingredients completely to showcase like what are decolonized foods, right? So we cut out things that didn't exist here before. So in our foods, there's no dairy, no wheat flour, no cane sugar, no beef, pork, or chicken. There's a lot of plant diversity. It's just super, super healthy. But I realized early on that people didn't understand the concept, really. What does it mean to decolonize, you know, and what are pre-colonial foods? So I think it's really important that to understand that, we have to understand what does that term mean? What does the term colonialism mean? Right? I mean, what is the definition of colonialism? So to truly understand colonialism, you have to dig deep. So you have to Google it. So if you Google colonialism, you'll get a pretty good definition. The policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying the settlers, and exploiting it economically. So this isn't something that's unique to North America by any means, because this has happened all over the globe. So it really doesn't matter which nation you're in. If you're in North America, South America, Africa, India, Southeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand, Hawaii, there's been huge, vast regions of the world that have been directly affected by European colonialism, and so many indigenous communities have really lost so much. Complete land spaces, language, culture, life, you name it. It's happened everywhere. So it's really important to understand just the history of where we are, and it all really starts with this notion of doctrine of discovery, which basically gave Europeans the justification themselves to say, like, if we discover it, we own it. But, try that at a Best Buy or an Apple store. It's not going to work out so well for you, Like, look at this MacBook I just discovered. I claim it. But anyways, you have to remember how very young we are as a nation in the United States. Like, we barely have any history at all, So if you look at what does the United States even look like in the year 1800? In the year 1800, we're still basically the 13 colonies, We're still at war with Great Britain in 1800. That's not ancient history. The western frontier was Ohio, back then, and western Pennsylvania. Like, there is so little history. So during the 1 century of the 1800s, so 1800 to 1900, so much happens against indigenous peoples on this continent. So there's no reason why those histories should be completely erased or removed, or so many of us grow up without knowing those histories, because it's not ancient history. So during this time period, we see things like the Louisiana Purchase, which, defines a huge chunk of land space for the United States government. We see the western half in the middle of the 1800s redefined of what is U.S. and Mexico borders with the Treaty of Guadalupe in 1848. And you just have to remember, though, at the beginning of 1800s, all of that open space was still occupied and stewarded by indigenous peoples, as it always had been. And a lot of those indigenous communities hadn't even seen European people in that time period, even up until the mid-1800s for so many places, right? So the U.S. really kind of pushes forward with this sense of manifest destiny, believing that they could fill that gap from coast to coast and take over that land space, because the United States government finds out very early on that if every time they take over indigenous land spaces, that they're able to parcel it, commodify it, sell it, and make a ton of money. And the United States becomes extremely rich, selling millions and millions of acres of land spaces over this 1 century, on top of, just the full-on colonization of pulling out natural resources, mowing down entire areas like Wisconsin and Minnesota, digging up mines and all sorts of things. So again, it's just interesting to think how fast that happens. So during that 1 century between 1800 and 1900, again, so much damage happens to indigenous communities, because they're basically at war. Genocide is happening. People are getting moved to completely different spaces. California wipes out 90% of its population between 1850 and 1870. They do a census in 1874. I want to say, in California, and they were only able to count 14,000 indigenous peoples after hundreds of thousands of them had been there at the beginning of that century. And they had state-sponsored bounties, which were paid back by the U.S. government. And I did the math one time, and it came to be in the millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars were spent on state-sponsored genocide during that time period with those inflation rates, if you dig that up. So at the beginning of that century, over 80% of the landmass was under indigenous control, and by the end of that century, less than 2% of that landmass is under indigenous control, only because of the reservation system, so I wouldn't even say control. So the 1800s, we see things like the Indian Removal Act under President Andrew Jackson. We see the Homestead Act in 1862, which continuously breaks up more indigenous land spaces to commodify and sell and take away from indigenous peoples. We see the Indian Appropriation Act in 1871. where indigenous peoples are no longer thought of as foreign entities, but stewards of the United States government, basically. We see the Dawes Act of 1887, which even breaks down further how much land spaces indigenous peoples can own individually, and only males at that time period. And we just see a lot of occupation happening, so a lot of colonization happening, a lot of forts being held, and a lot of battles being held. So this is just a map of a whole bunch of native battles just during a 30-year period of the United States being really aggressive against all these different nations out there. Here in Minnesota, we see the Dakota Expulsion Act in 1863 after the Dakota Uprising. And they passed this act through Congress, making it a law, making it actually illegal to be a Dakota person. And they also passed the Winnebago Expulsion Act at the same time, even though the Winnebago had nothing to do with the Dakota War, and kicking both nations out of the United States government, or out of the boundaries of Minnesota. And there was bounties against Dakota and Winnebago people during that time period also. So if you were caught, you could be murdered, and you would get paid for the proving that you killed somebody, meaning a body part of that indigenous person. So this law actually has never been lifted from Congress, as far as I know. So I believe it's actually still illegal today to be a Dakota person in the boundaries of Minnesota, despite having lots of indigenous communities, Dakota communities, especially here. And it's just, we just have to think about that a lot. So it's just a really harsh time period, and we should just be thinking about the struggles that people had to go through right here in this very land space, We see a lot of loss of indigenous foodways happening to indigenous peoples, just because the United States government knew that by removing food sources that they would make the tribal communities easier to conquer, right? We see an extreme change also in the environment because we see all of this colonialism in full effect. Can you imagine what Minnesota would look like with full-on old-growth forests everywhere, that have been growing for just generations and millennia, right? And to have that mowed down within probably a 40-year period, which what makes up Minneapolis, the mill city, because they're milling all of these logs and things coming down through all these forests, right? And even just the complete destruction of crops and seeds against indigenous peoples. One of the first things that President Washington does is take retaliation against the Six Nations in the Northeast, because a lot of them sided with the British during the war. So in 1879, he sends out General Sullivan with the orders for the complete total destruction and devastation of the settlements of the Five Nations in that area. And General Sullivan sets out during that summer in late May of 1779, and over the single summer, by the end of September, he accomplishes that, pushing all indigenous communities into Canada. And the Haudenosaunee still utilize the word, their word for U.S. president means town destroyer, because that's what they are, and that's the word for U.S. president in that language today. Out west, we saw a complete destruction of animals like the bison, the American bison, because there was millions of them out there. The United States Army did a survey to find out how many were there, and they came up with hundreds of millions of these animals out on the plains in the west, right? So they decided that it would be easier to remove that source that would hurt so many different tribal nations across. So they sent out years of people just slaughtering these animals. In 1874, there's this survey that says there was over 2,000 hunters out there on the plains, and that just one party of 16 reported killing 28,000 of those animals in a single summer. So we see this complete loss of life and this complete detrimental change of environment, just like breaking an entire chain of environmental pieces, right? And it's just, it was super, super intentional, because the United States government was behind this. The Congress had multiple talks about how to proceed with these situations and giving the okay to do this, because they had to decide if it was easier to completely wipe away indigenous peoples or just hurt them so badly that they were no longer a threat. And they kind of went with that latter. So after they get through all this stuff, what's most damaging to us as indigenous peoples was the eradication of our own educational systems. So if you take a moment to identify, what does the term indigenous education mean, right? Because obviously we didn't have giant universities out there. But what we did have was the privilege of having thousands of generations of knowledge, giving us the tools to live sustainably, utilizing plants and animals, and understanding our own diversities, because we knew there was a lot of other groups out there around us, right? And we were able to trade. We probably didn't get along with everybody, and that's human nature, is what it is. But during this time period, we lose all of this as reservation systems are formed, as assimilation efforts are forced upon us. And it's, again, this is my grandparents' generation, right? So I think about my great-grandparent, my great-grandfather, who was born in the 1860s, and during his lifetime he sees a lot of battles between the Oglala Lakota. He was in Crazy Horse's band, and they see a lot of struggle between the Lakota and the U.S. government. He's 18 during the Battle of Little Bighorn, and then eventually he sees everybody get pushed onto Pine Ridge Reservation. He sees his kids have to go to boarding school. He's there to witness the Wounded Knee Massacre of just massacring hundreds of women and elderly and babies and children, right? And the United States awarding themselves for that battle. And then he's there to see some of his kids even grow up and fight for the U.S. government. Like, so much to witness within a single lifetime. That wasn't that long ago, because that was just my great-grandparents' generation. So during this one generation, where these kids at the turn of the century should have been downloading thousands of generations of amazing knowledge, of plant knowledge, of animals, of religion, of stories, of everything, right? But instead they're forced into colonial boarding schools, like this one in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and they're forced to go here. It's a military-run school, so it's not a fun place for little kids, right? They're punished harshly. They're taught corporal punishment, which has lasting effects, because the trauma that these kids receive has dwindled down into our generations, where we're still struggling from some of these same kind of abuses that these kids went through, because these kids had to go through mental abuse, sexual abuse, just all sorts of, just physical abuse, all sorts of stuff, right? And a lot of these kids don't even survive these boarding school systems. And right now in Canada, they're finding all of these unmarked graves, and they've only searched just like 5 or 6, out of hundreds of them, right? So the person that starts this in Carlisle, which is the first of these models, it was all based on that they could kill the Indian and save the man. So it was their notion that they could take these indigenous children and turn them into something what they thought was proper. But really, it's just creating an entire generation of trauma for these children, again, which are my grandparents' generation. These boarding schools pop up all over the United States. And they're called residential schools in Canada, and they do the same thing. They're all over the place up there too. And it's just a really harsh system that these kids went through, which are my grandparents and my parents' age of generation of children. My mom will not talk about boarding school at all, because some really intense trauma happened there, and she's not even ready, even in her later days, to even talk about those situations of these kids being forced into religions that had nothing to do with them, being forced into trades that have nothing to do with them, and being punished super harshly. A couple of years ago in 2018 in Ottawa, there was a ceremony that was held to try and find as many names as they could of the indigenous kids that perished at the residential schools of that one state. So this is just a quick moment to take a look, just to see every name on that banner is the name of an indigenous child that perished in the residential school. And they know that this is only a small portion, because now they're discovering a whole bunch of unmarked graves of kids that aren't even named on this. But let's just watch this for 2 seconds to pay a little bit of respect. Oops, sorry. It's remote. Go back. So sending your children to school, you shouldn't have to worry about them surviving or not, but that's the reality that indigenous peoples had to go through. And just remembering that that list is just a very partial list of the names that will never be recovered out there. So there's a lot of reparations that has to happen, and the U.S. hasn't even started that journey of even identifying a lot of the harshness that happened at the boarding schools down here. It's only happening in Canada right at this moment. So in the 1900s, we basically go through an entire century of invisibility, of segregation, and a whole bunch of other harmful policies that still have a lot of direct implications on us today. So we're not even citizens as indigenous peoples until 1924. So my grandparents were born before they were even citizens on this land space that they were originally from. We can't vote as indigenous peoples until a lot of other people of color until 1865. And because there was a lot of state rules still out there, like where I grew up in Pine Ridge, South Dakota, we couldn't vote until the 1980s because the U.S. government, the South Dakota government refused to take votes from unorganized counties, meaning the native counties that were out there at the time. Now they've just redistricted everything, so they've just gerrymandered everywhere, which is pretty, unfortunately, normal. We couldn't celebrate religions until 1978, which is well within my lifetime. So it would have been illegal to celebrate religion for me upon my birth and my parents until that point when they were old enough to have me. And there's just a lot of things that we have to think about that still affect us, you know, and that's a big reason why we don't have Native American restaurants everywhere, because we were just traumatized for so long that we haven't even had a chance to barely recover from any of this, let alone identify it right now. So understanding what is food in post-colonial Native America, you would think, like, what is Native American food? You know, what does that even mean, right? Because I get a lot of press requests from people, and people are always like, oh, you're a Native American chef, especially this time of year when Thanksgiving's so right around the corner and it's so inappropriate, but it is what it is. So they're always like, you know, what kind of food did you eat growing up? Because they want to hear the cool stories, like, oh, you know, I'd get up in the morning and take down an elk with a slingshot, and we'd cook up a big feast and gather a bunch of stuff along the way. But that wasn't the reality, because for me, I grew up with the Commodity Food Program, which is, you know, the FDPIR, and it's just, unfortunately, a very nutritional-less diet, and we have a lot of issues that stem directly from this, and we have a lot of data of what happens to entire communities when this is their main source of nutrition. So there's no reason to debate why we have such high rates of type 2 diabetes, obesity, and heart disease on some of our reservations. Some of our indigenous communities have upwards to 60% type 2 diabetes because they're either getting food from this source or they're getting food from convenience stores, and there's just no access to healthy indigenous foods or healthy food in general. And when I was growing up, there weren't even the pretty colored things, you know, it's just basically straight up American beef with juices, you know, yum. And a lot of people think about this as an indigenous piece, but Indian tacos or fried bread tacos, whatever you want to call them, they taste good, but they really have nothing to do with us because we didn't have wheat flour. You know, this was shown to us from the military of how to survive because they'd be giving us staples like lard and flour and salt and sugar, but we didn't have ovens, we didn't have anything, so they showed how to make a simple dough fried in a pan, and then this is born. But there's no reason that this one piece should identify all of us as indigenous peoples because, again, it has nothing to do with us, and we're just way too diverse as indigenous peoples. So to understand indigenous food systems, you have to understand diversity, because that's the biggest key to this whole piece, right? So just looking at North America alone, like thinking about all of the ecoregions across North America, there's swamps, there's mountains, there's high plains, there's deserts, there's tropics, there's Arctic, there's tundras, there's all sorts of stuff, right? When you layer indigenous peoples on top of that, one way to see that is through language maps. So if you look at an indigenous language map, you can start to see how all this diversity starts to work. So every 100 miles, you're in a different language group, there's different mythology, there's different stories, and there's different food everywhere. And that's how we should be thinking about North American food in general. It shouldn't, obviously, what is North American food? It's not hamburgers and Coca-Cola, right? It should be really about the region they're in and having a true understanding of the indigenous peoples that had survived there for millions of or who knows how many generations before Europeans showed up, and all the different foods that they're eating, because the Western diet's never taken into account this bounty of amazing world around us, like all these different plants that offer so many different flavors and things like that. So still today there are 634 tribes in Canada, 576 I believe now in the US, 229 are all in Alaska, and 20% of Mexico identifies as indigenous, and almost 10% of the population still speaks indigenous languages over European languages, because it doesn't matter who's speaking Spanish or English or weird French, those are all colonial languages, right? So it's just, we have to understand the true backbone of this land space that we are on right now today. And there's no comparison to the diversity when you look at colonial borders compared to like the indigenous territories. And there's no hard lines amongst these indigenous territories. Things are very fluid, and things move and change. So when we're thinking about indigenous education, it's not just a study about how we eat, it's a study about how we survive, how countless communities survive for thousands of generations just living with the world around them. So it's a study in wild foods, permaculture, native agriculture, seed saving, seasonal lifestyles, ethno-oceanography, hunting, fishing, butchery, sugar, salt, sugar, fat productions, crafting, land stewardship, cooking techniques, regional histories, traditional medicines, food preservation, fermentation, nutrition, health, spirituality, gender roles, sustainability, and more. There's like so much to understand. It's an entire food system. It's in how this society exists, right? Living so close to nature. And one of the best places to start is plant knowledge, right? Because I always used to tease that our kids can name more Kardashians than they can tree species. And that's because, like, a big part of our own educational system, right? We should be teaching things that matter, and understanding plant knowledge is really, really, really important. We should really, truly understand it, because when you start to open your eyes and learn the names of the plants and the value that they have all around you, you'll stop calling everything a weed if you don't know what it means. That just means you don't know. So, go out and check the name. Literally today, you can download an app and take a picture of a plant, and it'll pretty accurately tell you what it is. We have so much information at our hands. There's no reason for us not to know. And the more you learn plants, the better, because there's all sorts of amazing stuff out there. There's sours, there's bitters, there's all sorts of vitamins and tubers, and just understanding how people were surviving, what kind of carbohydrates were people utilizing. This is a prairie turnip that we harvested when I was growing up on Pine Ridge that we call Timsala. That grows even in these regions out here. If you're in the Pacific Northwest or Northern California, in those regions, the camas root is such a really important carbohydrate. Here in Minnesota, we're so lucky that we have this really, truly beautiful wild rice that grows naturally on these lakes. And it's nothing to do with that black wild rice you see at the grocery stores. And it's such an important resource, and that's why a lot of us within these indigenous communities are fighting so hard to keep big oil and petroleum out of those really delicate ecosystems, because it's not a matter of if these pipelines leak, but when they leak and how much damage will it do, and will those wild rice beds still be there for future generations, because we don't know how bad that situation can be with one big oil spill and some of these really natural beauties. We should be protecting this. We should be stewarding this, not endangering it. That's a big part of the fights that are going on, and it's been a losing battle, obviously, moving forward. But just understanding that this has made countless generations happy, healthy, bountiful for so long, and we're endangering it, and we're allowing that to happen right now. So, and water plants in general, if you live on the coastal regions, just that knowledge of water plants is so important, because people just have so much countless knowledge of what to do with which parts of these plants and which parts to harvest and how they make us healthy, because all of our food is medicine, Or if you're in the desert regions where all the plants look like they want to hurt you or maim you, indigenous peoples knew how very well to live with them, and which parts to harvest and when to harvest and how to harvest and how to do it sustainably, so you're not damaging those plants or those soils or those environments, to make sure, because we're symbiotic, we have to live with the world around us. Proteins is a really easy piece for studying, because I think literally we stopped using cows, pigs, and chickens, and there are other protein sources out there, despite that's all you're going to find if you go to any restaurant. But, people learn about indigenous peoples in the North America and the bison and how they would break down every part of the bison to utilize it as something. But that's just a study of our resourcefulness as indigenous peoples, because we didn't have the privilege to be wasteful like we are today. Today we literally buy something and throw it away moments later, right? And back then, we carried very little with us, because that's all we needed. We were able to survive with very little, and I think there's a really strong lesson there about being resourceful and about utilizing less as we move forward with life. But again, any animal out there can be an important food source sustainably, and we don't need a ton of protein to live. You know, we absolutely can survive with very little amounts of protein, right? And this Midwest diet where you have to have a 25-ounce steak with a huge baked potato and all that stuff, like that's not normal, you know. That feeds an entire family in most countries of the world. And people should just be afraid of different kinds of proteins because there's all sorts of amazing stuff out there. Even insect usage. We have insects on our menu in Minneapolis and we're selling a ton of them. Like I was surprised actually how much that was selling. I just wanted to put it out there to make it normalize it a little bit. This is a quick video. I did a class in Palm Springs with an indigenous school there, and there was like this super spring thing going, super bloom spring. I don't remember what they were calling it. It had some key term, but like the desert was just lit up with all these beautiful flowers, and there's these caterpillars everywhere, and the kids were complaining about them because they're all over campus, and you couldn't walk across campus without stepping on them. And I was like, well, this was actually an amazing food source for the peoples that lived here for a long time. And then some of the kids were like, well, can we try them? So I was like, sure, why not? So we took a bucket outside and gave them some tongs, and the kids grabbed a bunch of caterpillars. And here's just a little, watch their faces. So we're going to boil them up first, and then we're going to fry them up with some chilies, and some onions, and some achiote. But we made it fun, and we made it interesting, and that day every single kid in that class ate a bug, right? And then every class thereafter came in saying, we just heard that class ate bugs, we want to do the same thing. So we spent the whole day cooking bugs with kids. Probably not to the benefit, their parents probably wouldn't like that, but we were out of there by then, so it was fine. But again, it's just normalizing it, like shouldn't be afraid, you know? Agriculture is something that we really believe in to understand, because indigenous agriculture is highly unsung in North America, but it really should. People should really pay respect to how much indigenous peoples contributed to what we have today when it comes to agriculture. Because we think we're at the pinnacle of everything when it comes to agriculture today, but we know what this style of agriculture is doing to our soil, the amount of chemicals it's taking to do this, the dangers of these GMO seeds that are being produced that you have to unlock with certain chemicals to even utilize. And we're basically just creating more desert spaces and ruining more water systems. And it's extremely damaging, and this is not the way of the future. It just can't be. And especially when you see titles like, how worried should we be that glyphosate was found in our Cheerios? Like, you guys should be very worried about that, because you can't get away from that stuff. That stuff gets in your body, like binds to you. Like, we're just giant lab rats, you know, for these big chemical companies to see what's going to happen to this entire generation after taking minuscule amounts of these chemicals over a long period of time. Like, it's going to mess us up, you know. And it's so hard to get away from. That's why we should be eating foods that are unprocessed, and we know where they're coming from and who's putting what on them. But when it comes to indigenous peoples, like, they had so much technology when it came to everything: architecture, sciences, agriculture. When the Spanish first showed up to what is Mexico City, they had all these wonderful, really cool raised bed gardening systems, and they're growing things just like the Mayans were: corns, beans, squash, chilies, sunflowers, tobacco. And you can follow it northward and southward. It goes both directions. But going north, like, this is a Zuni farm in New Mexico where they figured out how to irrigate and farm in the middle of the desert, growing the same things as the Aztecs and the Mayans: corns, beans, squash, chilies, sunflower, tobacco, stuff like that. All the way out to the East Coast where they have the Three Sisters gardening system where they grow the corn, they plant the beans crawl up the corn stalks, they plant the squash grows are all around the ground to help keep it covered, and becomes this really cool symbiotic growing piece. Or even way out here in these regions, because the corn culture crawled all the way up the Mississippi and Missouri River valleys, all throughout this region too, way out to the Dakotas. So this is a woman named Buffalo Bird Woman. She's a Hidatsa woman in North Dakota, and she's growing a garden of squash, of corn, of beans. Same thing they were growing down in Mexico, just different varieties, different colors, different shapes, all those kinds of things. But same styles, but you know, different farming styles. Like, she's using a row system here in North Dakota. There's a really cool book out there called Buffalo Bird Woman's Garden, and it chronicles all of Buffalo Bird Woman's memories as a Hidatsa farmer before she ever saw European people, and how they farmed everything. She's using a buffalo shoulder bone hoe. She used a deer antler for rakes. It's just a really amazing story of indigenous agriculture from that perspective, but it's even more rare because it's coming from a female perspective, which is almost unheard of in history, let alone from an indigenous woman. So it's a really cool book to utilize, and I think it's a really important document that we have today. The Minnesota Historical Society in St. Paul has her actual tools in their archives downstairs there. But it's just important to think about like all the amazing diverse agriculture that still exists out there. Like I've been really close to a lot of indigenous seed keepers to find out who still has these indigenous seeds and if we could still grow them out and utilize them. And I think it's just really, really important that we do everything we can to protect them. Because there's just so much culture and diversity, and we have to be stewards of these seeds in our generation. Somebody has to take care of them for the next generation, and nobody else is going to do it except for our generation. So we have to just be aware of what little is left and how much work we have to do to protect what little is left moving forward. So reclaiming indigenous health and culture through food is a big part of where we are. How do we pay homage to a lot of our indigenous ancestors? So when we started businesses, we started just doing that. We started training our employees how to go outside, how to identify plants, how to utilize these plants, bring things back into the kitchens, and process things. And how do we make food taste like where we are? You know, how do we create our own pantry, our own indigenous pantries, right? And being able to create entire teams, and we've been slowly growing. We started with nothing. You know, we started with a food truck a few years ago called Tatanka Truck, where we're just making food taste like where we were. So this is a picture of rabbit, of white cedar, of wild rice, of cranberry, and you can literally stand in the forest in Minnesota and look around and identify all those pieces right there in front of you. That's regional food, right? So. And it's fun to be creative. It's fun to explore the world around us and to see what flavors we can come up with, especially as chefs. You know, we can put creativity in everything we do, but keep things simple and healthy. You know, because we cut out colonial ingredients, we're gluten-free, dairy-free, sugar-free, soy-free, pork-free. Like, it's extremely healthy, right? We're not bug-free, though. We do have crickets on the menu, so. And the biggest part was getting this food back into tribal communities, especially some of these elders who haven't had access to their own foods for so many years. A lot of the elders remember their grandparents utilizing some of these ingredients here and there because they were still born into it, but a lot of that knowledge started passing, and today's generations just don't have it. So we want to normalize this, we want to get this back out into indigenous communities, and it's absolutely something that we can do. So a big part of our work with our nonprofit is helping to design indigenous culinary infrastructure out there, and looking at it as a pan-indigenous situation. So not just where we are, but basically everywhere. So when we're looking at, so our nonprofit is called NATIVS, or North American Traditional Indigenous Food Systems, and we have two main goals. One of them is creating access to indigenous foods, and the other creating access to indigenous education, because those two components are the things that the US government had taken from us. They took away our education system, they took away our foods, and we're pushing back on those two fronts to put it right back in front of us as indigenous peoples, and we can totally do it. So right now we have Indigenous Food Lab. It's in Midtown Global Market on Lake Street in South Minneapolis. We've been doing a lot of food relief there. So we were born right during the George Floyd situation, where all of Lake Street was completely destroyed around us. And we started doing 400 meals a day, just helping out our community and getting food out there. And then as the winter came around with the pandemic going on, we started sending healthy indigenous foods directly to tribal communities. So we were working with 9 out of 11 tribal communities and sending 10,000 meals a week out of that small kitchen with a very small team of less than 20 people all winter long. So our main goal, though, with Indigenous Food Lab is to create a really strong educational department with a lot of curriculum development. What we want to do is work directly with tribal communities and helping them to develop their own indigenous culinary operations so they can themselves feed themselves, and we can help them with recipe development, menu development, we can help them with food supplies and all those kinds of things. And we can even work with higher education facilities and their culinary departments so they can start to normalize indigenous foods on their menus too. So it doesn't just come around once a year with Thanksgiving, right? Which has nothing to do with us as indigenous peoples. It's kind of a forced story on us, right? So we really just see so much opportunity for making some big change, because once we get out there into those tribal communities, we can push for more community gardens, we can push for more permacultural landscapes, because lawns are fucking stupid. Like, we should be putting food everywhere possible out there, you know? We should be growing food absolutely everywhere we can and utilizing community support to help preserve and harvest and collect and create create pantry for much needed food relief in our own communities. That's totally doable. You just think about these huge campus lawns, like what if we just had food forests everywhere and then utilized a lot of community support to harvest and collect and create huge pantries out of everything. It's not that hard to grow perennials that will just continuously kick out a ton of amazing cool food that's nutritional and healthy, and is part of our area. You know, it identifies us as to where we are. It's really important to help support the creation of more indigenous focused kitchens, so we have trained professionals on what to do with all these wild foods when they come in the door, these harvested foods or whatever they are. You guys can find our first cookbook, the Sous Chef's Indigenous Kitchen. I'm sure your campus cookbooks or your campus bookstore probably has some, maybe, I'm not sure, but you can find it, it's out there. But there's over 100 recipes. We won a James Beard Award in 2018 for that one. We're working really hard to develop all sorts of indigenous knowledge and curriculum so we can utilize this within our own classrooms for all ages, for really young age children to adults. And we're utilizing things of like just reclaiming some of our narratives and understanding, because this is a map of all of Minnesota. It still has all of the indigenous namespaces around us, so we can remember. And there's a book that goes along with this that showcases what each one of those names means to the Dakota people. So we're really lucky that we still have some of this educational resource out there. We want to see more opportunity to create more indigenous food producers that we can help develop through our own nonprofit at Indigenous Food Lab, because we truly believe if we can implement this into tribal communities that we can really make a huge change. Because if you can control your food, you can control your destiny, just as our ancestors did for countless generations all over North America. As we grow, we want to open up indigenous food labs in regions all over the place, because we can be in Seattle, and Denver, and Albuquerque, and Boston, Chicago, each one becoming a regional center point to develop more indigenous education, create more indigenous food producers, and to help tribal communities everywhere, and create distribution points for getting more indigenous foods out there completely. And we believe that we can cross all these colonial borders, and we can do this on a worldwide situation. We can help people in Africa, in India, in Southeast Asia, South America, in Australia, New Zealand, Hawaii, because it's the same situation. We carry so much commonality as indigenous peoples all across the entire globe. And again, we have to steward indigenous knowledge for future generations because it's in such peril and danger, and it's being wiped off the map still today. It's actively happening in places like Brazil, where indigenous communities are being burned down and massacred still right now at this very moment in time. And it gives us an opportunity so we can define cultural appropriation. So for us, this is not only a revolution of indigenous foods, but also an evolution of indigenous foods as we move forward. And for us, it's just doing everything for the next generation. It's like we can only do so much in our lifetime, but what are you going to leave behind you for the next generation? That's the biggest question. So we're just trying to build framework for the next generation, because it's that next generation that's going to be the leaders. And we want to give them more than what I started with, which was nothing on Pine Ridge Reservation except for U.S. beef with juices. I want them to have better than that, and I think we can get there. So we want, we believe that you can do so much work in your lifetime to help the next generation out, and that's what you should be thinking about, because everything is bigger than who you are, and you have to think in those terms, right? And we don't have to live in a world where these kind of things identify us as indigenous peoples, because this is not who we are. We are something bigger and stronger, and we're going to showcase how valuable our knowledge is and how our knowledge can help save the entire world when it comes to understanding better food systems in general. So you can find out a lot about our work through these places and these websites, and you can also come and visit us at our brand new restaurant called Awamni, downtown Minneapolis. We were just named one of the top 50 restaurants by the New York Times 2 weeks ago. Minneapolis Magazine called us the restaurant of the year, and we're just 3 months old, so. Our restaurant sits right on the shore of what the waterfalls used to be before they renamed them St. Anthony Falls, and before they were destroyed by all the logging and mill work that happened in downtown Minneapolis, because this is the area, this is what it looked like before everything. You can see the Dakota Village in the background right there, and our restaurant's right on that same side of the shore right there. So we just truly believe that we have so much work to do, but as indigenous peoples that we can change the world, and we hope that we have a lot of allies moving forward. So thank you guys so much, and I know we have a couple of minutes for Q&A.
passion has ignited some excitement for you and hopefully stirred some questions. So I will bring a microphone out to you so we can hear your question.
Yeah, just make a multiple choice, please.
Hello, my name is Randy Peck, and I've worked at Carleton for 30 years. And you summarized 30 years of Native history. It was a secret. It was a secret, and it started here, seeing the Dakota Complex when I was young. And I used to see the natives running down on Christmas, day after Christmas, in 20 below to that ceremony. And so what you summarized was everything I've learned. And thank you, because it's so interesting, and it was a secret for many, many, many years. And the secret's out.
Absolutely.
So thank you very much.
Thank you. Amen.
Hi, my name is Eloise. I'm wondering how Indigenous nations are currently coping with climate change and how that's evolving the food systems that are currently in place.
I think that climate change is obviously very real, and as Indigenous peoples, we have had to be very adaptive and evolve, and we're going to continuously have to do that. There's things out of our control, and some things within our control that we can do, but things are going to change dramatically. We're seeing things like just wild rice is kind of slowly dissipating from the southern edges of where it grows northward because it likes the really cold waters, and the waters are becoming too warm. And even certain fish, like this year, trout season was awful because it was just too warm, and the trout weren't growing. So there's just going to be a lot of implications like that that change. But things are going to evolve, and things are going to adapt. The earth will continuously adapt also. And as humans, we have to adapt with it. And we're not going to have a choice. And we're just going to have to be really closely monitoring the earth and everything that's going on with it. And I think Indigenous peoples have that connection where we're just already deeply in touch, and we're just going to be watching, but knowing that change is coming.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for sharing your time with us. I have a specific culinary question. So looking at the photos you showed us of a few of the dishes you prepare, you use pine needles. I grew up in northern Minnesota. I used to like pull things off the tree and like chomp on them and be like, ew, what does this taste like?
Yep.
And I'm wondering how you cook with like evergreen needles and how you use it in your dishes.
I think the conifers are so nice just because we use them for a lot of tea. We utilize them for a lot of braising and seasoning. White cedar is one of my favorites because you can just chop it up fresh and sprinkle it on some food. It's really potent, you know, and it just smells like the forest. And like when I'm up camping, I like just grabbing a few different conifer things, so a little spruce, a little balsam fir, a little white cedar, just throwing everything into a pot, and just making a really wonderful tea out of it. It's just so soothing, and it tastes like the forest, you know. But it's such, and there's so much vitamin C in there, because you think about people not having access to a lot of vitamin C. If you're going through these long winters, because we're in Minnesota, where we have like, you know, five months of really nice growing season, and then we have like 25 months of winter, right? And then so like how are people surviving in those long winter periods and making simple things like some of these teas where you're getting a ton of vitamins, especially vitamin C, out of these greens that are growing all around us all year round. So I just encourage people to try some, you know, just, and if you're out there harvesting, just, you know, maybe not harvest near the freshman dorms about waist level below, but above.
Thank you for your very inspiring talk. I'm wondering what we can do as non-Indigenous people to help increase your vision.
I think that, you know, we're all in this together, and we all need a lot of support. We all need a lot of allies. I think we need to support a lot of Indigenous initiatives as much as we can. I think we need to support a lot of Indigenous food growers where we can, and just really do everything we can to help create a more localized food system, and to really celebrate the regions that they're in. So there's all sorts of pieces out there, and there's all sorts of areas needed for help, you know, whether it's food distribution, food production, culinary, academic, academics, and curriculum design, and there's just a lot of work. So our nonprofit is really open. We're opening up in Midtown Global Market as part of our Indigenous Food Lab in a couple of months, a native market. So there'll be a place for people to buy a lot of native food product, and we're also putting a native classroom. There'll be a lot of community classes that people can sign up for. So if you want to sign up to learn or to see a guest speaker, they can do it through there, or learn about nixtamalizing corn at home, or any of these kinds of situations. So we're just trying to create spaces to help more education and more development, and to be ourselves an incubator, you know. And we put a call out a lot of times when we're doing a lot of food relief for a lot of volunteers, so you can just follow us, keep an eye on us, sign up for our newsletters if you want to. But there's a lot of organizations that need a lot of help, so just keep your eyes open and see what you can find.
Hi, yeah, so I know you mentioned that you're not really interested in this like cream of mushroom soup cooking, but do you ever use indigenous ingredients to sort of reconcile or reference modern food? Like, are you ever making a cedarberry and bison bologna sandwich with spruce tips and, you know?
I think it's completely open. I mean, because if you come to Awamini, we have a whole bunch of fun, creative food pieces on our menu, you know, and we're just playing, first we're just figuring out what is our pantry and like what kind of pieces are we using. So over half of our menu is plant-based, but we have a whole bunch of really interesting proteins. So we've got antelope and elk and rabbit and duck and whitefish and walleye and just a whole bunch of cool things. We even have some Northeast foods on this menu. So we have like quahogs and mussels and stuff like that too. So there's just, you know, we're just really open, and we can, you know, just celebrate indigenous cultures everywhere. And we're trying not to fusionize all the different cultures, but really make food taste like a certain place, you know. And that's kind of our hopes. But it's wide open. Culinary, you know, you can make whatever you want to. So if you want to make an indigenous bologna pizza sandwich, then you can do that. You know?
Hi, thank you for your talk. I was just wondering, this is more of a culinary question. So could you walk us through your process about how you develop recipes in your kitchen? Like, what do you look at? Do you look at sort of family recipes or historical accounts? Like, how do you create your menu, essentially?
Yeah, we pay homage to a lot of traditional recipes, and on our menu we have some things that are very traditional, like we have a blue corn mush with some juniper ash seasoning in it, so it just lightly nixtamalizes that mush. For an example, which is something really typical in the Southwest that I've seen a lot, but we add some maple to it too, which is very typical in the Northeast, you know. And there's just, so we look at some of those base recipes, but we just try to keep the food really clean. So we have things like nixtamal, which you might know as pasole or hominy, with just the light chili sauce. We've got tepary beans, which are these really cool drought-resistant beans that grow in the Southwest, and we use those a few different ways. And we try and purchase as much as we can from indigenous producers first, and then we just try to utilize, you know, identify what our pantry is right now, the seasons. Like I have a freezer full of aronia berries because it was such a big aronia berry year this year, and we just try to be really creative with what we have to make our menu interesting. And so, yeah, it's just kind of an open, creative process. Like, there's all sorts of things. And even our desserts, we have a really nice dessert menu that's gluten-free, dairy-free, sugar-free, which that's typically a dessert, you know, but we're able to make all sorts of stuff out of without that, you know. And I think it's almost more powerful of it's not what's on our menu, but it's what's left off of our menu, you know, that people find striking, because there's no black pepper on the table, we don't have milk, we don't have a soda gun, you know, we don't have any of those kinds of things. You know, we're just using a lot of herbal teas that are from here, like using plants from Minnesota as our tea program, making a mocktail list out of all those kinds of same things, and making really beautiful drinks out of those pieces too. So there's just so much creativity that can happen, and we're creating a safe place to offer more creativity for a new generation of chefs to come through and see what we can come up with.
How does expense play into the food choices you can make? Because it seems like a lot of like eating local could be more expensive, and then how accessible that food is to like communities too.
It really depends. I mean, because obviously there's a lot of food. Like if you go to the farmer's market, you can find a lot of indigenous foods at decent prices. And it's really just we're just trying to create a lot of economic opportunity from our indigenous producers. Like we have a lot of buying power right now. So like wild rice, for example, is really expensive right now. The USDA kind of messed it up by putting wild rice onto the commodity food program. Because when I first started a few years ago, we were buying wild rice for $6 a pound wholesale, which was a good price. And if you were an elder in a community like White Earth, you could buy wild rice for $2 a pound. And because the USDA tried to implement has implemented wild rice into the commodity food program, that stretches the demand is so high that it stretches it out too far that we run out of rice here in Minnesota. And now, if you're an elder trying to buy rice on White Earth, it's $8 a pound. So like 4 times the price from just a few years ago. And for us, $15 is kind of a typical wholesale price anymore, you know. And it's just, we just have to really think about that constantly. But that's why we put our nonprofit into play to really help with a lot of food relief efforts. Because by creating a small native market through a nonprofit, we're going to be able to create a lot of food relief efforts and be able to create a lot of food kits that we can get out to tribal communities, to people that need a lot of these foods, and to try and we just believe that everybody should have access to indigenous foods. And we're hoping that we can put these nonprofit markets into communities all over the place to help supplement a lot of those food needs and create that indigenous food access that doesn't exist today, and do everything we can to make sure that they have access to it. And if money's an issue, I feel like we can be smart enough to find ways around the money situation, because there's support out there. So there's a lot of solutions that we still have to come across, but it's a really solid question to try and figure out how can people afford healthy, nutritional food, and what steps can we do to ensure that can happen for the future.
And our last question will be over here.
Okay.
And this is, first of all, gratitude for you coming to Carleton and sharing really the future of where we need to do, what we need to do as a country and also as a world. And so certainly thank you for that. If you would so indulge me, I would like to, Sean, take it to a greater thank you, not just to you, but this, Carrie, if you could come stand beside me for a quick second. Carrie Rod has been a part of the Carleton community for 32 years? How many years? 26 years. And this is his last convo. Carrie Rod, for the last 26 years, has done the Free Friday, has put together schedules for Carleton, and I think it would be, we'd be remiss if we did not thank Carrie for his service to Carleton for the last 26 years in doing these weekly convos, and we miss him greatly. So I would just like to do a round of applause to Carrie.
Thank you. And I would say, too, the convocation program, spread the word. This is an exciting opportunity for our community to hear from people like Sean and expose us to new ideas and new perspectives. So continue coming. This will be our last one for this term, but they'll be starting up again in January. But for now, please join me in thanking Sean for sharing his passion with us today. Thank you.